Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's best books. I'm your host, Erik Rostad, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 52 books per year and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each book. Today I'm going to cover Our Hope by Father Dmitrii Dudko. This is book 44 of what ended up being a total of 45 books for my 2020 reading list. Well, this one's not exactly a bestseller. It has a whopping 5 reviews on Goodreads, and I am one of those reviews. And of all the books out there, it ranks number 2,600,000 as the most popular book on Amazon. So why did I read it? Well, first off, it was a gift. And second off, the premise is quite intriguing, especially after having read the Gulag Archipelago. So Father Dmitrii Dudko, the author, was a priest in Soviet Russia. He was a priest of the Russian Orthodox Church. And that was not necessarily a good time to be a priest. First off, they probably were going to close your church down because the basis of communism is atheism. So Christianity is not a welcome part of that. And so if they haven't closed your church, you can remain open, but you're very limited in what you can do. And you can basically run the ceremony. You can basically run the service, and that's about it. You can't speak outside of that. You can't preach from the Bible during that ceremony or during that service. You're limited to just putting forward the ceremony part of it. So what Father Dudko decided to do, he noticed that he was starting to get questions from his people, his parishioners, and he decided to just start answering those questions and to call it a dialogue sermon, but to take questions. And this way, he was skirting the law. He was not disobeying the law of not preaching, but he was simply answering his parishioners' questions. This brought a lot of attention, though. These dialogues started gaining a lot of attention, a lot of popularity, and people were just hungry to hear what he had to say. So it became very popular. But that brought some negative attention, which led to his arrest in 1980. And the authorities, whatever they did to him, they broke the man. And on June 20th, 1980, he was shown on Soviet television renouncing his activities. And people knew that, especially the way somebody would look on television, they knew that this was probably not of your own accord of what you were saying. Things were done to you that led to you renouncing, and that's what happened to him. He renounced his activities, and this book takes place before that, and so you kind of see the writing on the wall. There are 11 discussions total. There's 9 that take place in the church, and then I think the final 2 are either not in the church or one of them is even a discussion of an interrogation that he had. And so you see the writing on the wall, like he's not popular with the authorities. This is not going to end well for him. And to then hear that they broke the man, it's devastating. But to read these questions and answers is incredible. And I know there's a lot going on in what I just said, just kind of the brief overview of his life. But let me go back to the first thing I said about why I read this book, in that it was a gift. The person who gave me this book will actually be joining me on this episode in the next segment. His parents knew Father Dudko. And my friend Ivan, who will be joining me, he met Father Dudko as well when he was a small child. And so he gave me this book. He knew Father Dudko, and so we're going to get to hear from him and hear more about this man and hear a little more about the end of his life, because this book takes place in 1973 and 1974. These dialogues do. So we don't know much after that of what happened, and this book does not go into him renouncing his activities in 1980. So we'll learn a little bit more about that in the next segment here. But before we do that, just a brief overview of this man's life, Father Dudko. Born February 24th, 1922, he served in the Red Army in World War II, as did Solzhenitsyn. And then After the war, he entered Moscow Theological Institute, but was turned in by a fellow student in 1948 because Father Dudko had written a poem where he criticized the authorities for destroying the holy places in Russia. For that, he was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor in a Siberian gulag. He ended up serving 8.5 of those years until 1956 after Stalin's death. He was most famous for delivering these 9 sermons, and they were delivered at St. Nicholas's Church in Moscow, late 1973 to early 1974 timeframe, and that is the topic of these books. These question and answer sessions are broken up into chapters, and so he first gave these audibly, and then it was later transcribed into this book. If there's one thing that has stuck out in this reading project, it's that you learn a lot from people who have suffered. Some of the best books I've read for this project are written by people who have gone through just tremendous, unimaginable suffering. And there's just something about the lessons learned, the insight gained, the wisdom obtained that makes these books stick out. It's just something that you're not going to get in an average life. And you can tell that this man has suffered. You can tell by the answers he gives to his questions. Sometimes the answers will just be one paragraph, and you're just kind of reading that paragraph thinking, how did he fit all that in? And other times it will be multiple pages of his answer. But there is so much wisdom, so much packed in, that it is a powerful book in that sense. So as I mentioned, in 1980, he was arrested. He was broken, and by many accounts, he was kind of deemed an irrelevant man after that. But he deeply regretted renouncing his activities. He made some comments along the lines of he wished he had just rather died than to have had to live with that turmoil in his head of having renounced. And he lived for 24 more years after that. He died June 28th, 2004. So before I get into my thoughts about the book, some of the things that stuck out to me, let's get Ivan on and let's hear from him and hear stories about the man himself, Father Dudko. I've got Ivan with me here. Ivan, can you tell us your full name? Tell us a little bit about yourself, and then I'll start asking you some questions about your life, your family's life, and its connection with Father Dudko.
Awesome. That's really nice to be here on this podcast. My name is Ivan Nekrasov, or many people here in the US know me as Ivan. And I was born in Russia during the Cold War in 1975. When I was 16, we moved to Israel. And then after 8 years in Israel, I moved to the US.
Nice. So what was it like growing up in Soviet Russia?
Yes, it's hard to encapsulate it in a few words. So as I mentioned, I was born in 75. It was, the Cold War was still going on. There was still a lot of restrictions, on freedom of speech, freedom of religion or worship. I was born into a mixed family. So my mom was predominantly Jewish family, and my dad is mostly Russian, Polish, with a little bit of German in there. So, you can say polar opposites, as a Russian background can go, but it gave us as kids exposure to both sides, right? To Jewish faith and Jewish background, and to Christianity as well. My parents weren't religious, but they were definitely, identified as dissidents, right? So they, especially with my dad's background, his relatives were, during the revolution, were part of Tsar's army. My great-grandfather served in Tsar's army during World War I, right? Survived that and then died during Civil War. So some of my dad's relatives actually, lost everything, because of communism, and some even died in the Gulag, actually.
Wow. And were both, if you were Christian or Jewish, was it kind of equal persecution or equal lack of rights, or did one have more rights than the other?
So people who followed God, right, in any way were equally persecuted. So interesting part, right? My mom's relatives, her Jewish side of the family, actually fled Ukraine from the persecution by the people who supported the Tsar, right? So they fled because of pogroms. So if you watched Fiddler on the Roof, some Jews fled to the west and some ran away to Russia to flee that persecution. So some of them kind of remained faithful to their religion. Some actually became communists, right, as a way to protect themselves from nationalism. So but in terms of religious restrictions, they were imposed on everyone, right? So both synagogues and churches were, most of them were closed. So there was very few. I think in Moscow, there was only 2 synagogues, and out of hundreds of churches, only probably several dozen left open, right? So um, I believe before revolution, there was more than 300 churches in Moscow. And you could, I think, count the ones that were open during my childhood.
So how did your parents get to know the author of this book, Father Dudko?
So I actually contacted my mom before dialing in, right? And what she said is that he was fairly famous in the dissident circles, so people heard about him. And my parents used to go to like a park nearby where that small church where he was assigned to near Moscow, where he was a priest. So they decided to stop by and listen to him. So they came in and then started coming back. So I don't remember how many times they went back, but as one of my earliest childhood memories is being in the yard of the church and then going to his house for dinner and
Wow.
sitting in my dad's lap, and I could really hardly understand what they were talking about.
So on your parents' side of things, was it more for him being a dissident, or more of him being a priest? Like what was your parents' draw to him?
It was both, right? There was a deep hunger for truth, in a lot of people's hearts, right? So my dad was an engineer, so he was very highly educated. He had PhD in mathematics and physics. So he was a seeker, right? He definitely wanted to find truth, and and his friends were deeply analytical and philosophical people who would come and hang out, discuss Christianity, discuss Hegel, and everything in between. Uh, so so when they heard about him, they saw it was possible to go visit. They went and listened.
Wow. And so, from what I understand, this book took place between 1973 and 1974 when he gave these 11 or 12 discussions. So he was by the time that your parents were hearing him, was it during that time? Because I know you were born a little later, and then you would have heard him. So after this book was written and he did those discussions, he kept doing them then.
Yeah, so to my understanding is that at that point he was already doing discussions at home, so he was already banned from doing them in the church, right? So this happened, he got published. Once you get published overseas like he did, it was, he was, I guess, walking a very high risk path, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So to my understanding, this was the very end of his kind of public, anti, I mean, he tried not to say anti-communist, right? But his public kind of ministry that opposed atheism, there was the end of it. And then in 1980, just a year or two later, right, he had to recant on TV.
Yeah. Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because just in the book, because it was 6 or so years before that happened in 1980, you start getting glimpses that something bad is probably coming, because he starts getting interrogated. They start taking him in, but since the book ends earlier than that, we're not given any information of what happens later. I mean, I've seen some online, but what happened in 79 or 80, and did you see that on television when you were there? Like, I guess describe that whole situation.
So personally, I did not see it, right? But I remember my parents talking about it, and some years later, I remember asking, like, why aren't we going to that place anymore?
Hmm.
And they said, well, the government basically closed it down, and to my parents, like, what they believed is they believed that he was tortured, right, or threatened severely, right? So he didn't look good on TV. Like, it didn't look like a voluntary, confession. In their
Hmm.
mind, he was definitely forced to do it, and most likely under threat of, harm to his family.
Yeah.
I,
Wow.
what we knew, that quite often, again, this is just a possibility, right? But we had friends, or my parents had friends who were given psychotropic drugs, right? They would arrest them for, let's say, for, proclaiming their faith publicly, or for sharing books that were illegal. And, you know, it was enough to say that you believed in God for you to be considered schizophrenic, right? So if you stayed quiet and didn't tell anyone, you could believe whatever you wanted, right? But if you were
Hmm.
more public about your faith, or about disagreement with atheism or communism, you basically could be arrested for anything, right? They could say, well, you talk to God, means you're talking to someone who doesn't exist, means you have an imaginary friend, you're schizophrenic, put you in jail, psychiatric jail for, years, and, give you severely heavy medications.
Hmm. And then after that, they said he was just never the same. He
Yeah.
was just kind of a broken man, and there are a few quotes from him where it's just heart wrenching, but he's so saddened by recanting. He said that death would have been better than that, like the turmoil in his head from having done that.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it's hard to read it, and it's hard to read this book knowing that that's going to happen in his future, because he had been in the gulag. He'd been in there for 8.5 years, and then even in these discussions that he's having, he's talking about he's ready. He's ready if there. He's even being interrogated in there, and he says, I'm ready for you to shoot me. I'm ready to go. uh but they were able to break him, and it's sad, but you just can't imagine. I mean, just can't imagine even what that would be like, to have to go through that.
Yeah, I think it is, you know, and we don't know, like, if we were put in this situation, none of us know how we'll actually react. We can dream as followers of God, we will be strong, and but we actually can't guarantee that. One of my favorite
Hmm.
other authors is Richard Wumbrent, a Romanian Jewish pastor who spent 14 years in solitary confinement and in jail in communist Romania. And he said his encouragement was, even though he stayed strong, he said, never judge people who are going through that, right? Because
Yeah.
we just don't know. He's like, we never know how we will respond,
Yeah.
and whether people are in the underground church or in the church that was submitted to the government officially.
Yeah. And Viktor Frankl has a quote that's really haunting, where he says, "The best of us didn't make it." The the,
Yeah.
the best of us didn't live through this,
Yeah.
and it's just such a haunting thing to think about. So in your interactions, I know you were very young, uh, but maybe I guess from some stories from your parents as well. What was he like? What was Father Dudko like?
um, so from the stories, and from me being a kid, he was a kind man, right? Me as like a 4-year-old in the yard of his church or at the table, he seemed like a very nice kind of kind grandparent type person, right? He seemed old. I think he was fairly actually young. He's probably 50s back then, but to me he seemed very old because he was older than my dad. But he was considered to be a kind of a teddy bear person.
Yeah. That's fun. And then your parents were also hearing they were meeting other dissidents. They were hearing other stories. Well, on kind of a broader scale, the Gulag Archipelago had a huge impact on me reading that, and just learning about that. Your parents were learning about these stories all the time, and people who didn't survive the gulags, or maybe they did survive, and your parents were hearing their stories. What are some of the things that stick out to you about that time, about what they were hearing, the stories they were gathering? What are a couple of things that really left a deep imprint on you?
I would say the deepest imprint was, just seeing my dad at night, right? Listening to the Voice of America or Free Europe, every single night. He had this huge, old radio unit sitting in the kitchen, and, he will dial in, and the government was broadcasting noise on the same radio waves that, Free Europe was broadcasting actual news. So you had to sit with your hand on the dial and adjust it all the time to be able to avoid, the humming of the military machines that were trying to block the sound. So just,
Wow.
every night after night, my grandmother was listening to the Soviet news in her room, and then, I don't know if we were doing it on purpose or, so neighbors couldn't hear what my dad was doing, but, and then my dad was sitting in the kitchen listening to, VOA, and knowing how, knowing to some extent that it was dangerous, some of the things that my parents did, they never told us until we left, so like every time I talk to my parents who live in Israel now, they tell me something new,
Wow.
but one of the, I would say, just brightest memories of that radio experience is in 1984. I was 9 years old at the time. I came into the kitchen at night, asked my dad, "What are they reading?" And he said, "Well, they're reading 1984." And I'm asking, "What is it about?" He said, "Well, it was a prophetic book that describes how we're living now." And it was very difficult to find books, right? So the books were smuggled from the West, like books like 1984 or Gulag Archipelago. Even though it was written by a Russian, you couldn't get that. You could lose your freedom for having anything like that, or Animal Farm, right? If you're talking about George Orwell's books. The same, like we didn't know that Dudko wrote a book, right? I literally found it in the US. Like I had no idea that he wrote those books back then. So
Wow.
yeah, and then people would pass it around, right? So people were hungry to know the truth, right? The same was with the Bibles, and Dudko mentions that in his book, right? That the people would pass the Bibles around, and he said if you get a hold of one, write notes and kind of like copy the scriptures that speak to you the most,
Yeah.
So and it happened, to buy a Bible, you had to, pay literally your monthly salary to actually buy one on the black market.
Wow. Wow. So the book is called Our Hope. He spent 8.5 years in a gulag. He was under almost constant threat of being rearrested. He had a wife, he had kids. That's not a very hopeful scenario, not a very hopeful situation. But as you mentioned, he was a very kind man. What comes through in the pages of this book is a very wise man. I say a lot in this project. Some of the best books I've read are by those who have suffered. And there's an insight you get. There's something that happens that an average person is never going to reach those depths. And someone who has suffered has reached a different level. They've had to go deeper. They've had to do things that a lot of us can't even imagine, and that comes through in this book. And the questions he gets, sometimes he'll take a few pages to answer. Other times it's a paragraph, and it is so strong and impactful. But with such a life, such a dire circumstance in Russia for his life, why did he title it Our Hope?
Yeah, and I mean, I love the title, right? Because for me, it speaks volumes to me about, how my parents were able to live under that as well. But we, for the most part, we didn't live in fear, right? Because, my parents provided us a very, I would say, peaceful environment, but and hopeful as well. But as somebody who is reading the Bible now, in the light of my childhood, in the light of what my parents, my ancestors lived through, and in the light of the books like it, I think Christianity and faith has a very different meaning from how it's usually presented, in the Western
Mm-hmm.
countries that are a lot more prosperous,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I think he was able to see, right, that Jesus's ministry, right, it happened, in Israel under Roman occupation, right? It was a very hostile environment,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it was all about having that hope in, impossible situations, right? Knowing
Mm-hmm.
that, God is our hope. And Dudko quite often mentions, he says Russia is Golgotha, right? So he said it's a place where the crucifixion is happening, but he said where crucifixion is happening, that's where the resurrection is happening as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that hope, the joy of knowing the hope is tied to the suffering itself.
Wow.
And for me, even living now, let's say having teenagers now during the pandemic, right, that gives me ability to, I guess, translate that into this suffering that they're going through, and saying, hey, the book is for us, right? If you embrace God in your suffering here, the suffering turns into joy, right? And that's the concept that I think I've only seen in the persecuted church.
Yeah. Wow. Well, one final question for you here, and throughout the book, he identifies the biggest problem as atheism, and that stuck out to me because he had spent time in the Gulag because of, you would think, because of communism, but he didn't identify the problem as communism. He identified it as atheism, and part of that may have been just to try to avoid trouble by calling out a different thing than just than calling out the government, by calling out more of the spiritual side of it. But he calls the biggest problem in Russia at that time atheism. What do you think the biggest problem in the States is right now?
I would say it's the same problem.
Hmm.
I think atheism is destroying the moral fabric of the society, right? That's what Russia went through, right?
Mm-hmm.
So atheism being the core of the communist ideology, denied morals, denied existence of God, destroyed the family intentionally, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then societies started falling apart so fast that they tried to bring some of those concepts back. Like a concept of family was, reinstituted. They had the communist family, communist morals, but it was sort of too late, right? Russia is still trying to rebuild what the communism destroyed, or what
Wow.
you can say what the atheism destroyed, right? So the abortion rates, the divorce rates, the mortality rates, alcoholism rates, everything is 50%. I think Dutko mentions divorce rates were 50% back then.
Mm-hmm.
Abortion rates at some point were 50%,
Wow.
in Russia. Uh, Alcoholism rates, some statisticians say by Western standards, 60% of adult males are alcoholics, right? So it destroys the society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it was, and he kept saying that he was doing, the government should be applauding him because he's getting people out of alcoholism, and he called it hooliganism and fighting, and in these things that were destroying the fabric of Russia. He called himself a patriot, and I just thought that was really interesting because everyone in power was saying he was not a patriot, and here he is. I'm trying to help build the people of Russia. I'm trying to help them, and it didn't end well for him in that sense, but maybe in another way it did. So, well, that was really interesting. It's amazing to read a book and then to be able to talk to somebody who has met the author, especially someone like this who just an incredible life. And so thank you for joining and sharing what you know about Father Dudko and what your family went through. I can't imagine, and to hear stories and just, to know that you were born in that situation. Your parents were, and then your grandparents, and they lost family members in the Gulag. Like, we're not far removed from this. It's not some ancient history that this stuff happened. And so thank you for joining.
Oh, you're welcome. It was my pleasure.
Gotten to talk to Ivan at some other times just about the work that his parents did, and one of the things that they did is they collected stories. If you were sent to the Gulag, you were disappeared, and if other people mentioned that you were gone, they were considered sympathizers, and they might also be sent to the Gulag. And so when someone was sent to the Gulag, that was the end. You didn't speak about them anymore, and quite often they just disappeared from history. They died in the gulags, and that was it. And so part of what Ivan's parents were doing were collecting stories of people who had been killed in the gulags, and history had forgotten, but they collected these stories, and you obviously couldn't have these stories during that time, and so they would write them down and they would hide them, and they were collectors of stories. And I just think that's an incredible thing, and an incredible tribute to lives lost in such a horrible and tragic way. So in segment 3 here, I want to cover 3 things that really stuck out to me in this book, Our Hope. And the first is this. It's about heroism. So I'm going to read a paragraph here. Let's look at life. It doesn't take much to become an atheist today. Master a few prepared phrases, swim with the current, and you're an atheist. On the other hand, to be a believer, you have to know a lot. You have to bear a lot of difficulties. You have to swim against the current. It takes a heroic spirit. It's not an accident that believers today are heroic people. End quote. I marked that paragraph down because it made me think of, when you're on these social media networks, you're connected to people that you haven't seen them in a while. Maybe they're friends from high school or college, and you're still connected. And one day somebody will post something, and they've come to the light, and they've realized all these things, and you look at what they've written, and there's no heroism in it. I mean, it's everything going along with the current. All they're stating is what is popular, and they somehow came to that conclusion, and everyone pats them on the back. And I thought this paragraph really spoke to that. Let's look at life. It doesn't take much to become an atheist today. Master a few prepared phrases, swim with the current, and you're an atheist. And that seems to be a lot of what happens, and we see that happen. And I just liked that he described, but to swim against the current, that takes a heroic spirit. The next one, I wanted to contrast the book Homo Deus by Noah Harari. And that one we read for the project in 2018, and Jason and I covered that on a podcast episode. And part of what that book is talking about is if these are the beliefs that we have as a society, for instance, the soul is dead, what are the ramifications for that? And what are the ramifications as we start using artificial intelligence? We start using AI more and more. And Harari's idea is that we will be starting to become these God men, these homo deus, will become God men. And it's frightening. And the picture that's painted in that book is not necessarily a pleasant one. And so there were a few points in it, and I just wrote Homo Deus in the side of the page that I was reading. And so I want to read these paragraphs because I think they contrast well with what Harari was talking about in Homo Deus. So here's one of the answers that Father Dudko gives to one of the questions that he receives. Here it goes. To sum up, evil entered into the world by sin. Sin is an act of man's free will. Man was seduced. He then had to understand freely through his own experience, just as freely as he was seduced, that sin carries no happiness in itself and that he must be delivered from sin. The creation of the new man consists in this. In the creation of the new man, both God and man take part. God and man should become like one whole, the God-man. End quote. So it's a little different than the description in Homo Deus. And the other one comes a little later in the book, in answer to another question, where he says this: man denies God because he himself wants to become a God. There's no other explanation for atheism, but it's time we understand that deifying ourselves leads to a dead end, one from which we cannot escape except by turning to God. Otherwise, there's ruin. End quote. Just found those interesting way to contrast what we read in Homo Deus. The last thing is atheism and the soul. Here's a paragraph in the 9th discussion. I look at the notes I get, which say that anyone who attends my discussions will be transferred, and I'll be thrown in jail or in a mental hospital. I view this as simple alarmism. We're just too scared. We're getting to the point that we're afraid of everything. But it is precisely atheism that we ought to fear. It's more horrible than war or the plague, because with those only your body is destroyed, but atheism destroys everything, including your soul. End quote. The reason I highlight that one is that will tie in to my one key takeaway from this book, which I will cover in the next segment. Now in segment 4, in the one thing. This is a tough one. I knew going into this book that he later recanted and was forced to do so on live television, and that destroyed him. That it just broke the man. And as far as I know, he never spoke about what happened. I don't think it's known what happened. We can guess based on what happened to others. But something happened, and he recanted, but he regretted that, and he hated that he had done that, and he had wished that he had died instead. The turmoil and the pain of having done that was so bad. And so while reading this book, I knew that happened at the end. But during the book, while reading the book, he's talking about how he knows something may happen like that. How he may get arrested, he may get shot, he may get tortured, but he's ready. And you're reading it knowing, but was he ready? And I don't know, and we don't really know. He lived 24 years after that happened, but we don't know all that went into it. We do know this book. We have this book as a living testament of his life, and it's over a 2-year period. But this stands, and so do we look at this as his life, or do we look at that he recanted in 1980? Do we look at his years of suffering in the Gulag, how does it all fit together? It reminded me a lot of a book from the 2018 reading list, Splendor of God, by Morrow. And Morrow was a missionary from the United States into what was then Burma, and this was the early 1800s. And this man, if there was ever a man who sought the face of God, it was this man, Morrow, this missionary to Burma. And he suffered dearly for that. He lost his wife, he lost other family members, he was just sick all the time. And at the end of the book, there's this scene where he's met another woman later on in life after his first wife has died. And she tells him that he can see God in, they're like on this mountain and just overlooking this beautiful scene. And she says, you can see God in that. And yeah, it's a nice sentiment, but it after this man is seeking after the actual face of God through everything you've read up until that point, for somebody to say, oh, just look at the trees and you'll see God in there. It's almost a letdown. It's almost a disappointment. But you look at the fruit of that man's life and what resulted in Burma and what is now Myanmar, in terms of people who came to faith because of this one man throughout the years. You still see his impact today, 200 years later. And so it was similar in that sense for this book, Our Hope, by Father Dmitrii. You see the impact of his life. You see this book. You can buy this book. You can read this book. You can hear his answers. You can hear his answers forged through suffering from honest questions by his parishioners. And these words speak today. So when you look at his whole life and you see this recanting, and then living 24 years after that, just in turmoil of the mind and in disgust with himself for having done that. How does it all fit? How does it all tie together into a life well lived? I don't have an answer for that, but that's where my mind goes, and that's where it went in reading this book, and how it tied in just with that last thing I read in segment 3 of, we're getting to the point that we're afraid of everything, but it is precisely atheism that we ought to fear. It's more horrible than war or the plague, because with those, only your body is destroyed, but atheism destroys everything, including your soul. So what is the life well lived? What is it that we should go after? Is it just for things here, or is there something to this soul thing that in Homo Deus, in Harari's book, he says it doesn't exist. So let's proceed. Let's see where this road leads if there is no soul. But then you read books like the Gulag Archipelago, and he said, my soul was nourished in the Gulag. How is your soul nourished in a place of such suffering and torture? You read a book like Our Hope by Father Dudko, and he says Russia is experiencing true faith right now because of this suffering. And you see the suffering of Morrow, the man who went to Burma as a missionary, and you see what came of that, of his suffering. So there's something to that. There's something to the suffering and the good life, which runs contrary to a lot of what we hear of the good life being pain-free and full of joy and full of riches and that's what you're striving for, right? That's the good life. But maybe it's not. And if things get bad, where is our hope? That's going to do it for today. Thank you, Ivan, for joining. It's a pleasure to have you on. And I look forward to further discussions and learning more about your life and the things your parents learned from those who suffered in Russia. You can find out more about Books of Titans by going to booksoftitans.com. I've recently revamped the website. I have a lot of resources on there now. I have a spreadsheet you can use to track your own reading. I have a coffee mug that you can now buy. And I also have an option where I can become your reading mentor. I can put together a list of books for you to read. I'll buy them for you and send them your way. That's an option now on the website. And I will handpick your particular set of books based on what you want to learn, your interests, books you've read in the past, and I'll put together a reading list for you. If you're interested in that, you can check it out on booksoftitans.com. Go to the resources page and you'll see that option there. You can also follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter. And I'll be back in a couple of weeks, and I'm going to be talking about the Chronicles of Narnia. I'll cover all 7 books in that one episode. So I hope you'll be back and listen to that episode. Until then, keep learning, keep reading. I'm out.